All right, hello everybody, and welcome back to Two Catholics Thinking. We're glad you're joining us today, and we're excited to break open another topic with you. So, Brenden, good to see you again, and thanks for being here.
Great to be here.
All right, so in thinking about a topic to explore, one of the things that's always been very interesting to me is what the Catechism has to say about ultimately like what went wrong with our first parents and the sin they committed in the garden. And I think that the reason this is worth reflecting upon is because sometimes we can look at that story and think, all right, so the world is in this mess because we ate some fruit we weren't supposed to eat. Like that's the point of that story. And I feel like there's definitely something far deeper going on there. As we know, there's two accounts of creation in the book of Genesis. The first account where God creates in 6 days, rests on the seventh. The second account where God forms man out of the ground, blows into his nostrils the breath of life, and then places him in this garden. We got a garden with these trees, Adam and Eve, and a serpent, and this whole story, right? And when we go through that story, we hear that, you know, the temptation that seems to be placed upon Adam and Eve in the garden is that they wanted to be like God, right? The serpent comes along and said, you're not free to eat from any of the trees in the garden. They said, no, we can eat from the trees. It's just this one, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that we can't eat from. And God said, if we eat it, we're going to die. And the serpent says, you're not going to die. God knows that if you eat it, you'll be like them. And so it seems to be that the temptation was that they wanted to be like God. And I've always wondered, well, is that bad that they wanted to be like God? It doesn't seem that, because in the first account of creation, it says God made us in his image and likeness. So it seems that God wants us to be like him. And the Catechism very interestingly says that what went wrong wasn't that they wanted to be like God, but that they wanted to be like God without God, apart from God, and not in accord with God. So I interpret that as like they wanted to ultimately like snatch for themselves what could only be received as a gift. And so as this temptation is placed upon them, there's a very interesting line in the Catechism right before Eve eats the fruit. It says in Genesis, she looks at the tree and she saw that the tree was good for food, pleasing to the eyes, and desirable for gaining wisdom. And so she took some of its fruit and ate it. You can almost imagine Eve like looking at the tree thinking, this is a really good tree. This may be the best tree in the whole entire garden, and God doesn't want me to eat from it. And you can almost imagine Eve beginning to think to herself, like, maybe God's like holding out on me, right? Maybe God's like keeping the best from me. Maybe God doesn't actually have my best interest in mind. Maybe God isn't even trustworthy. Maybe he's not my friend. Maybe he's actually my enemy. Now, obviously, none of that is said in Scripture, but I think we're kind of justified in almost imagining that kind of thought process because of what the Catechism does say. It says that what went wrong was that they let their trust in their Creator die in their heart. What opened the door to disobedience, what opened the door to sin, seems to be a lack of trust. And the Catechism even goes on to say that every subsequent sin throughout history, which is crazy to think about, literally every sin throughout history, is not just disobedience to God, but a lack of trust in God's goodness. And to me, I feel like that's helpful in recognizing that obviously sin is a problem that prevents us from living in right relationship with God and with each other. But there's even like a problem before the problem. And I think that more fundamental problem is this lack of trust. And so I wanted to kind of throw that out there and kind of break open this idea of how we see trust or lack of trust related to sin, and then how God's mercy and God's love kind of is wrapped around that whole situation.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I think there's a temptation to look at the whole story of sin and punishment and this kind of a legalistic kind of mindset that like God set up this rule and we broke the rule and God punished us, and it kind of puts God as, I mean, this judge, jury, and executioner. That he's just a vindictive God that has these rules that we have to follow, and they're arbitrary, and he just forces this, and a lot of people ask that question like, well, I mean, if God intended for us to be in the garden and intended us to follow him and be with him, why put the tree of knowledge of good and evil in there in the first place? Why put the temptation there? And I think that it, when you look at it through this paradigm, looking at it through the idea of trust, suddenly it changes. It's not like, well, God set us up to fall and set us up to find these temptations, but that it's necessary in the relationship. Like for a relationship to actually grow, there has to be trust. And there's going to be an inevitable test of that trust that comes. And I think that's where this comes, and that's where I think it sheds light on how the devil is operating. That it's he's using lies and deception to make us doubt the goodness of God and make us doubt that he's for us and not against us. So I think it opens up a lot of questions and a lot of ideas around this topic that sometimes can be very easily misunderstood.
Yeah, I think that it's very important to remember that in the garden that God created, a number of trees that are there, but two trees are named specifically: the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And only the tree of knowledge of good and evil is the one that they weren't allowed to eat, which I think is important for us to realize that means God intended for us to have life, right? Like he created us for life. And when we hear like the knowledge of good and evil, sometimes I think we can think that tree represents the ability to know what is right and wrong. But I think that might not be the best way of reading that, because ultimately, as rational beings, we're able to know what is right and wrong. Even us now, as fallen creatures, we can, through the use of reason, we can think, you know what, if we constantly destroy one another, that's contrary to human flourishing, right? Like it's bad for us. If we constantly live in deception with one another and we're stealing from one another, that's bad for humanity. So even in our fallenness, we're able to discern through the use of reason certain truths of morality. And so the Catechism says that the tree of knowledge of good and evil doesn't so much represent the ability to know what is right and wrong, but the ability to determine for oneself what is right and wrong. And I think when God says, look, you're free to do whatever you want in the garden, ultimately, like Pope John Paul II says, we were given a vast and far-reaching freedom, but it's a freedom that has to ultimately respect its creaturely limits. There's a certain point after which we can't cross. And when we do so, it's not just breaking a rule, it's ultimately like denying our status as creatures of a creator. And so God says, you can do ultimately whatever you want, but what you can't do is make good evil or make evil good. And so I think what happens to us as human beings is we convince ourselves that we have this power to determine it for ourselves. And again, this idea that we want for ourselves what could only be received as a gift. God wants us to have life. He wants us to be set out on the path of life. But in order for us to do that, we have to trust that he is the giver of life. He is the author of life, knows in fact what will lead to life and what is contrary to life. And we see this reflected in the fact that as soon as they sin, right, what happens? They lose access to the tree of life, showing that sin of its very nature is contrary to life. Sin by its very nature is deadly.
And I think that kind of comes into play, like we realize that the tree of knowledge of good and evil is this redefinition of what is good and what isn't good according to my standards. And I think you can even get kind of an insight, like if you think of like Kant's categorical imperative that said like you can't have a moral maxim that you can't universalize, because like lying is bad not because, in one sense it's bad because it violates truth, but it's also bad because it only benefits me if what you hear me when I lie, you think what I'm saying to you is the truth. So you couldn't universalize. You couldn't say everyone should lie, because that doesn't then no one would believe anything, which is kind of where we're at with, nobody believes anything right now anyway. And so that's the problem with lying. And that's the same, that's why a lot of people can come to that recognition of the universality of something like the Ten Commandments, because if everyone was going around killing everyone, things would not be good. But we have the tendency to want to make the exception for myself. Well, okay, yeah, that's bad for everyone else, but I can do it because of this reason, this rationalization. And that's the temptation of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, is that I want to define what's good and evil based on my standards, not God's standards, not some universal standard, but one that's going to benefit me in my selfish desires, because I'm afraid that God's not going to provide for me. I can't trust him to give me what I need, so I'm going to try and provide for myself.
Yeah. You brought up something very interesting, this idea that, when we ultimately sin, I think at that very moment, we convince ourselves that it's actually good, it's actually right. Because as rational beings, none of us think, you know what, this is terrible for me, this is terrible for anybody else, but I should probably do it anyway, right? We convince ourselves at that moment that no, right now, for me, and in ordinary circumstances, this isn't good, but for me, for right now in my circumstances, this is actually what's right for me. And I think this is where the Catechism is very wise in saying that ignorance of the fact that we have a fallen nature gives rise to all sorts of errors, including in the realm of morality. Because if we don't realize that we have a darkened intellect and a weakened will, it's easy to think that everything that looks right is right, or everything that feels good is good, right? But we're fallen. And so the Catechism actually also says, too, that when we sin, not only is it like contrary to God's law, it's even contrary to reason. Which is kind of funny, like sin is dumb, right? Like it's dumb.
Yeah.
Because what is actually makes sense in a rightly ordered way is to live according to what is true and what is good. But again, because we have a darkened intellect, because we have a weakened reason, we don't always see as true what is in fact true. And this is where, I'm remembering St. Thomas Aquinas asked the question of, like, if we can know through reason that we ought not to kill one another, why did God also say, thou shalt not kill? Right. And he said the reason God said it is because not everybody is able to arrive at that truth through the use of reason. And so just in case, God was like, all right, just in case you miss it, just in case you mess up in your journey there, let me tell you clearly, killing is bad, right? You ought not to do it. So again, God like supplements our for our fallenness through the giving of the law.
And I think that kind of goes back to that whole idea that God does provide for us. Like he realizes that we have this weakened will and this weakened intellect, and so is like, okay, I'm going to give you the law. Like he chose the Israelites and said, here, this is the law that I'm going to give you. And he left the light of reason for the rest of humanity, for the Gentiles. But he's like, okay, for one people, I'm going to tell you straight out, this is what you're not supposed to do, so that you can become an example to everyone else. But the Israelites still struggled with that trust in the Lord. Like, there's those warnings that he says, don't go down to Egypt and get horses and rely on military strength and military alliances with all these other nations. That's not going to save you. I'm going to save you. And they keep forgetting that, and that the fall into idolatry is the same thing. Is like, well, I like God and I'll trust him and everything, but can I have also this little household God over here, and we'll do some worship over here on this mountain, because I'm just going to hedge my bets. I'm going to hedge my bets and trust, well, if God, something falls through the cracks, I got this other God taking care of it over here.
Right. And I think this is especially relevant for like an agrarian people, right? So this temptation of idolatry that they always face, the other gods that they were tempted to worship were fertility gods, and even like agricultural fertility gods. And so as an agrarian people, that God says, just trust me. It's like, all right, I'll trust you, but just in case, here's my side bet on this God, because I need my crops to come through, And so you're right. Not only do they struggle with trust, I think, again, we struggle with this too throughout our entire lives. That I think we have a hard time believing that God is actually more interested in our happiness than we are. We have a hard time believing that God's way is actually the way that's going to be most fulfilling and most satisfying for us. I think most of us think, okay, yeah, really the way it comes down is like, don't do all these bad things, listen to what God says, and then you'll be happy in the next life, maybe, right? But you have to give up all this great stuff here. But God says, no. Anything I tell you to say no to, it's always part of a bigger yes to like what I want to give you, a yes to an abundance of life. And this is where, going back to this idea of God's providence and God's care and God's mercy, I see this on display even in Genesis. So as soon as they transgress God's command, it says they no longer allowed to eat from the tree of life that is in the garden of God. They hide themselves from God, now showing this disruption of relationship with God. They cover themselves with fig leaves so that there's this disruption of relationship between them. And God comes looking for them and finds them. And ultimately it says that God banished them from the garden, right? This idea. And the way I understand this is not so much that God says, well, you've been naughty, so now you can't have life. I understand it more as like, you've been wounded and so are incapable of experiencing the life that I created you for. And so what I need to do is heal in you your capacity to experience perfect love. But when it says in scripture, now this is like the English translation, I don't know exactly how it's worded in Hebrew because I have no skills in Hebrew, but it says God kicked them out of the garden, but he settled them east of the garden. And I liken it to be like, look, dude, you're out of the mansion, but here's a little studio apartment for you, right? Like, make sure you're still cared for. And in the same way, it says, that God made leather garments for them, right? This idea that like he saw them and be like, fig leaves, guys, like really, that's what you came up with. And so God's like providential care is still in place. And to me, the most fascinating part of all of it is we know the Bible is written by many people over a long period of time, but it's very striking that the first book of the Bible and the last book of the Bible both begin and end with a tree. In the book of Revelation, which is a story, to oversimplify, a story of a call to perseverance among the Christian faithful, right? Like St. John is saying, look, I know things look dark. I know it looks like we're being destroyed, but remain faithful, hang in there because God wins and life wins. And it actually says, to the one who perseveres, to the victor, I will give a right to eat from the tree of life that is in the garden of God. To me, that's beautiful. Like the entire Bible is a story of a tree, the story of God making us for life, how we lost access to that life through our sin. But everything God does from here on out is to try to bring us back to the tree of life, to remember that God created us for life. To me, that's beautiful.
And then, of course, there's the tree of life. The image of the tree of life is the cross. that Jesus dies on the tree and he becomes the fruit of the tree that we receive in the Eucharist. So we eat of the tree of life when we go to the table of the Lord. And so that, which I think that the cross in that sense is the ultimate showing that God will provide for us, that there is absolutely nothing that he won't give to us to make sure that we have life. That if he gave his own son, as an offering for us, as our very food, I mean, the image of the manna in the desert that when the Israelites were walking through the desert, God gave the manna from heaven. Well, the new manna that is Christ, that is the Eucharist, shows like that this providing. If God provided for the Israelites in the desert, and he provides for us with the Eucharist, he'll provide for us in every aspect of our life. And then ultimately at the end, that if we persevere, we will partake of the tree of life. And so, I mean, can there be any other argument that could be put forth that could say that God, it just shatters the lie of the devil that says, no, he's not providing for you. No, he doesn't care for you. He's holding back from you. He's held nothing back.
Yeah. And I think too, we see in the cross a remedy for our lack of trust. Because I think one of the ways that we can kind of look at the cross is, what we see on display in the cross is the full ugliness of sin, right? We see just how far we've fallen in our willingness to kill the God who wants to be in relationship with us. Like, sin can't get any uglier than deicide, right? That's what it is. And so Jesus comes and like silently endures the cross, silently, as Bishop Barron says, like swallows up the sin and evil, and goes to his grave. All of his followers, right, abandon him in his time of need. And takes that sin upon himself, takes it into himself, takes it to the grave. And on the third day, he rises from the dead. And it's always striking to me that when he comes to finally appear to the 12 in the upper room, they're locked in there, they're scared. Jesus appears to them, and his first words to them aren't, "Hey, jerks, thanks for abandoning me." First words are, "Peace be with you." Like, in a sense, to say, look, you've done the worst that sin can do. And my offer of life still stands. My extension of relationship, my invitation to relationship still stands. Now will you trust me? As you said, like, now will you trust me that I've held nothing back, that I'm willing to do everything? And this is where, when St. Paul says, I'm convinced that nothing will separate us from the love of God, because we've tried everything already. Like, we literally tried everything we could to try to shove God out. And God says, no, as far as you strayed, that's how far I'm going to go to call you back to myself. And so I see in the cross like this great demonstration of God's trustworthiness, that he is willing to give all, that he's willing to seek after us no matter how far we've strayed.
And I think especially in the cry of derision on the cross, my God, why have you abandoned me? God has gone into that God forsakenness. He's gone into the place where we felt most abandoned by God and shattered it by bringing his presence right in there. Yeah. So like there's nowhere it's like Jonah trying to run away from God, run away from being a prophet. There's nowhere he can go that God isn't going to be. So it's just God will find us no matter where we go.
So obviously, if the solution is in very many ways is to restore trust, right? To rekindle in us our ability to trust in God. Obviously, that's easier said than done.
Oh yeah.
And that so practically, what can we do? I would think, one, the more we get to know God, the more we will in fact trust him. The more we listen to him in prayer, the more we listen to him in his word. But there's also a sense in which, scriptures say, taste and see that the Lord is good, right? I think there's a sense in which God says, look, you might not always understand why I say do this or don't do this, but just try it, right? Walk down this path. And over time, as you begin to live the way I call you to live, you will begin to understand why I've called you to live that way. So I think there's a mix here of what we can do. One, seek to be faithful, even when it might be hard to be faithful, or it might seem counterintuitive to be faithful to what God asks us. But I think also through just cultivating that relationship through prayer, through getting to know God and his word, all of these things can begin to rekindle in us our ability to trust in God.
And I think an important step in that is to bring those fears and that lack of trust to God in that space of prayer, because that's what Jesus models for us in the Garden of Gethsemane when he says, Lord, if it's possible, take this cup from me, but not my will, but yours be done. He's showing that, like, Jesus dealt with at least the bodily, physical experience of fear of death, and bringing that to his Father and saying, like, I'm afraid, and I'm not sure if I can trust you, but I'm offering that to you in this moment because that's all I've got to offer you. But I will trade that for your love and your mercy and your trust.
Awesome. Beautiful stuff, man. Well, there's obviously like so much deeper that we could swim in this.
Oh, yeah.
But hopefully as we continue to learn and we continue to study, I think if we can wrap the whole salvation history narrative in this story of God making us for life and trying to constantly remind us and reassure us of his trustworthiness. Like, I made you for life. I still made you for life. I will always make you for life. I will always want life for you. You just got to trust me, right? Like, as a loving father, like, says to his children, like, I know you don't always get it, but just trust me. Trust me, I love you. Trust me, I want what is good for you. So cool, man. Thanks for taking the time to chat about this, and thank you guys for listening. I encourage you to continue to take this to thought and take this to prayer. And thanks for joining us. This has been Two Catholics Thinking. We'll see you next time.